In the Quran, the broadness of linguistic import is a problem, the acknowledgement of which constitutes a first step in understanding the corpus and the Voltenschau that underlies its construction. To take an example, ask, why would the word Fulk, by a slight diacritical modification, be applicable in as many different contexts and settings as it is? Settings so different from one another that the unity of the word is indeed called into doubt. Words with this broadness of import and cross-domain application are generally known as polysemious. Atomic words are polysemious if by polysemious we mean a word that changes depending on its context. For example, the word paper can refer to the substance or a printed publication made of that substance, or how the word bank can mean a financial institution or the side of a river. Both meanings are connected to the idea of storage or edge. Atomic words, though polysemious, extend beyond this point into polysynthesis, or polysynthetic language structures, a feature of language characterized by complex words consisting of several morphemes in which a single word may function as a whole sentence. Thus, atomicity, one can say, is a more technical, modificational syntactic framework that links polysemy with polysynthesis. Quranic words are atomic, employing a polysynthetic strategy in that the modifications applied to its terms are morphological operations that polysemiously generate context-specific meanings from a single root. Now, reading through these examples, the question naturally arises, what do these contexts have in common such that the same word would suffice by a slight modification to be applicable to all of them? We see that Fulk may be understood as an orbit or course which a planet or celestial object follows, a ship or vessel, or in Noah's case, a vessel built to protect from a flood. The importance of understanding atomic concepts really shows here. We must look for that function that's general enough as to be applicable in all three contexts.
A defining feature of atomic words is their intrinsic susceptibility to polysynthetic modification. Unlike static polysemous terms that merely accumulate unrelated meanings through historical accident, atomic words possess an internal structure that invites, even demands, systematic transformation. The central sense remains invariant, acting as a semantic anchor, but through morphological modification, new dimensions of application emerge. Consider this analogous to complex numbers. Just as adding the imaginary dimension, I, to real numbers doesn't negate their reality, but rather opens entirely new mathematical spaces and operations previously inaccessible, polysynthetic modification takes the atomic root and expands it into previously unthought semantic territories. The root FLK maintains its core meaning, circular motion, containment, vessel, but through vowel pattern shifts, affixation, and morphological operations, it generates Fulk, maritime ship, Phalak, celestial orbit, Aflak, plural spheres, and beyond. Each modification is not an arbitrary addition, but a systematic unfolding of latent semantic potential already encoded in the root. The atomic word doesn't just have multiple meanings, it generates them through structural transformation. This generative capacity, this responsiveness to modification while maintaining conceptual unity, is what marks a word as truly atomic.
A concept that is general is a concept that's more malleable relative to a concept that's less general. In mathematics, we look for averages because averages allow us to see patterns, compare and predict, i.e., to apply a more detached mode of thought to otherwise rigid and opaque quantities. They allow us to perceive in our object an order of relation that does not involve knowing every detail, but rather and this is the borderline miraculous thing about atomic concepts, to reconstruct details a priori, once the general idea we call atomic has been grasped. Suddenly, what can be obtained from so little, so simple an idea is incredibly vast. But as we noted before, to obtain that idea we must think inductively, to investigate some word persistently in different contexts, preferably in contexts that are thematically different from one another, until we can see in the divergences a common strand. The true import of atomic words, as we call them, seems to lie in this cross-domain presence. This is exactly what Moses was instructed to bring to the Israelites, if you remember from chapter 2, verse 67 to 71.
والفلك
If in one case it means ship
الفلك
or vessel, and in the other it means orbit,
فلكين.
then think, what's that element which either case features that can be found or gleaned in the other? As in, is there something vessel-like about the being or motion of celestial objects? And also, is there something celestial or orbital about vessels or ships? Do ships generally follow what might be called precise orbits? And do celestial objects move as a ship might sail? Yes, on reflection, the answers are positive. When God says that the celestial objects move in exclusive orbits, كُلٌّ فِي فَلَكٍ يَسْبَحُونَ, he's indeed describing the course which they follow, and this course being specified or specifiable reflects that function that we find in the word vehicle. In this very standard concept is found that idea which unites these contexts. In common usage, vehicle can both refer to physical structures and figurative schema. A car or a train on the one side, and, on the other, power lines and cables as a vehicle by which electricity is delivered to homes. Recognize the polysemous property of the word vehicle? Now, as a thought experiment, we were given a problem to deliver electricity to homes. Now, once you've recognized this, you're already thinking about how this possibility can, could, may, or would be actualized, as in, we're specifically and unknowingly contemplating what you would call the vehicle through which the service can most effectively be rendered. Now, generally speaking, a vehicle is a universal archetype of sorts, always required, always that medium or relating relation, and which is no less complex, no less primary and standalone as the things which it connects together, as William James stresses in his radical empiricism approach. What's noteworthy is that the connection is already possible by virtue of the necessity which the word vehicle introduces. It implies its conditions of possibility, the objective, teleological structure itself, as well as preconditions of necessity, i.e., the precise equation, or sufficient reason, if you will, that realizes in the situation its best and often only course of action. We don't have to doubt the possibility of A making the transition to B. The fact that R exists makes this given and possible a priori. This abstraction we're making of the necessity which the relation R, the vehicle, brings about is really our attempt at capturing that universal idea or class concept that we have here circumstantially called vehicle.
Consider terms like freezing, melting, molding, or growing. These are not merely predicates waiting to be attached to subjects. We grasp freezing directly as a specific kind of transformation before we ever think of the specific substance to which this process happens. The term carries its own content, a movement from fluid to solid, a particular quality of becoming rigid. Similarly, growing is understood as an expansive, organic unfolding. We know what it means independently of whether we're speaking of a child, a plant, or an idea. These relational terms have their own being. They exist as recognizable patterns of change that we can think, imagine, and understand in themselves, prior to and independent of the particular things that might exemplify them. The relation is not constructed from its relata. It stands on its own, waiting to be instantiated.
It's the archetype vehicle. This generic concept is exactly what we're seeing used across these Quranic cases. The exception is that in the Quran, the conditions in which this expression is concretized are also given. That is, the concept, though generic, is not restricted to the abstract, but is instantiated such that it's understood by way of the conditions which make this expression possible within the limits of the corpus. Now, what are those conditions? And let's add that the conveyance of those conditions is just a way of describing the world from the perspective of vehicle, as we saw in that cognitive scheme.
Consider this difficulty. When I perceive the sweet taste of honey and simultaneously its golden color, what is it that knows these are properties of a single thing? Taste alone cannot know color. Sight alone cannot know sweetness. Yet I am aware that the sweet and the golden belong together. Indeed, that they are unified in one substance. What performs this act of discrimination and synthesis? It cannot be the individual sense organs themselves, for each perceives only its proper objects. There must be, therefore, something beyond the special senses, a faculty that receives the data from all 5 sense organs, and being itself one, unites them into a single perception. This is the coin aesthesis, the common sense. It is not a 6th sense alongside the others. Were it so, we should perceive the common qualities: motion, magnitude, number, unity, only incidentally, as we perceive Cleon's sun, not as Cleon's sun, but merely as white. Rather, the common sense is the very principle by which the soul, though receiving diverse impressions from separate organs, remains self-identical. What discriminates must be one, for it is the same faculty that says, this is sweet and this is not white, and knows the difference between them. I found this immensely useful when reflecting on the words of the Quran, for a word is only polysemous because it's picked up by different sense modalities according to the situation. I think the different contextual applications of the same word in the Quran are an expression of the different levels at which our sense modalities interact with them. My research efforts into the soul all led to this conviction. I see a jar of golden Attic time honey, and immediately I remember its sweetness, its thickness, every impression it once made on my palate, at the same time as I recognize that it's golden. But I also know that it's a liquid, that it's derived from the belly of a worker bee, stored in the wondrous hexagons of a comb, facts that don't require direct contact with the syrup itself. I see all these things as a single object. If I followed the use of a word across different contexts, I know that every context represents a different order of sensibility. The celestial expression of fulk is uniquely different from the nautical or maritime expression. On the one hand, I see a ship be designated by that term. On the other hand, I see a planetary orbital pattern being designated by the same word. The common between them is a pure sensorial experience. You're not as aware of the difficulties involving navigation, the need to be logistically informed, property-oriented, directionally clear. Nowhere are you as worried about course-keeping, steering, and hullmanship as you are on a ship. There's no place more desolate than in the middle of the ocean, no place as vulnerable to loss as here, and thus nowhere as wanting of navigational skill, all the navigational skills one could possibly have. Nay, the idea of navigation itself is specifically born here. The Quranic usage conveys a sense of the object from 2 perspectives. An objective one where, standing on the deck of your ship, you gaze up and could see the movement of the planets, the positions of the stars, and can use them to guide you through. On the other hand, you have an idea of where you must go amidst what immediately seems a disparate and hopeless situation. You see how, in the second case, you have practically embodied the idea of folk, embodied. That is, you have entered into a psychological state. That state there is the experience, the being, the mind of what's supposed to be a pure object. That being said, I believe that the soul, or as you call it, cognition, the self-knowing psyche, miraculously embodies its objects once it has grown to know them at different levels, and then represents this knowledge to itself as an experience. And you know what? I believe the Quran uses its language in this exact way. It wants you to follow a word across different contexts so that when you eventually see the identical in the diversity, you can reproduce the experience for yourself.
Let us return to the problem of delivering electricity from one locale to another. This presents a remarkable opportunity to expand upon the concept of fulk. When you mentioned how fulk is an experience we embody, a cognitive state we find ourselves in when confronting logistically formidable situations, I recognized it immediately. It is precisely that state I entered when developing new apparatus in my laboratory, or optimizing or correcting deficiencies in existing models. Pardon me, I must correct myself. It is not so much a state I found myself in as a state I knowingly put myself in. It's a state, I'll tell you, without which I could never have visualized even the most minute technical detail, let alone conceived the foundational principles of electrical engineering itself. The conductor, as its very nomenclature implies, must be fashioned from a conductive medium. Copper, aluminum, or their metallurgical kindred, through which the electric current may propagate. The transmission of electrons through void or insulating matter remains, as nature herself dictates, an impossibility. Yet this represents merely the first impediment in a cascade of technical exigencies which must be systematically vanquished from the engineering perspective. The moment we contemplate the prospect of delivering electrical energy across considerable distances, we find ourselves inhabiting that peculiar domain wherein the conception, nay, the intuition, of the vehicle principle becomes self-evident. The second challenge concerns the conductive medium itself, resistance. As the electron stream traverses these elongated metallic pathways, voltage degradation occurs proportionally to the resistance encountered, necessitating either increased conductor cross-section or voltage elevation at the point of origin. Intimately related to this phenomenon is the unavoidable conversion of electrical energy into thermal waste, a consequence of resistive losses. We must therefore implement sophisticated cooling apparatus, air gap insulation, oil immersion systems, and allied technologies to prevent catastrophic thermal failure of the transmission infrastructure. Beyond these fundamental considerations lies the formidable problem of grid synchronization. Multiple generative sources must maintain absolute frequency coherence, whether at 50 or 60 cycles per second, and preserve phase alignment with mathematical precision, lest they oppose one another and precipitate systemic destabilization. Load balancing presents yet another dimension of complexity. Electrical demand exhibits perpetual fluctuation throughout the diurnal cycle, compelling us to devise real-time monitoring and dynamic control systems capable of harmonizing generation with consumption, thereby averting grid collapse. Finally, we must incorporate fault protection mechanisms, circuit breakers, electromagnetic relays, and protective systems engineered to instantaneously isolate compromised segments when conductors fail, transformers rupture, or short-circuit conditions manifest, thus preventing the cascading failures that would otherwise plunge entire regions into darkness. In essence, a compact self-correcting apparatus must be established to successfully conduct the transmission of electrical force from one terrestrial point to another. This principle, I observe, extends far beyond our electrical systems. It pervades all of existence. There is not an entity in nature that does not constitute, in its fundamental essence, an error-correcting mechanism. If we conceive of any entity teleologically, as embodying some definite function or purpose within the cosmic architecture, a purpose which its physical manifestation serves merely to expedite, we arrive at a profound realization. The instant we begin contemplating the means by which to actualize what appears impossible, we are already operating within that domain which the archetypal concept Fulk so elegantly captures. One might venture even further. The universe itself is inherently impossible, and the magnificent order we perceive represents nothing less than error correction operating at a scale beyond human estimation.
This is an example of how an atomic word, in this case Fulk, or vehicle, is gleaned in the Quran. We perform what's essentially a controlled thought experiment. The Quran gives all the scenarios wherein this concept is to be considered. We perform the thought experiment within those parameters, and what's derived is not so much a single idea as an experience which this single idea or insight stands for. Just as the image of a green leaf plays in your mind that scene of the water droplet that awakens the seed, the fibers slowly weaving the structure that leads it from a bud to a stem, the green pigment gathering in chambers as a small shoot unfolds into the leaf you see. The expression Fulk, or any other Quranic term, must serve that same function, but with a nuance. Notice how your vision of the green leaf isn't random. It rides on those facets that comprise the leaf's own being. It demands a certain architectonic view, conditions strung together by that which the experience itself approximates. In the Quran, the context in which some word appears are those conditions the assimilation of which makes the thought experiment possible, and by extension makes the concept imaginable. It's clear that by making this a demand, the Quran places a clear emphasis on the subjective factor. For it's this imaginary intersubjective discourse with the concept that allows us to understand the book the way it was intended and built to be understood. What may appear as ontological is only the world seen through the eyes of the phenomenon, conveying in more familiar terms the fact that it's the least element of that set. Change the lens and the world changes. Now, do you not see that gaping space that stands between you and the household to which you're extending a cable? That yawning chasm of engineering challenges is really the mental structure that we copy when grasping Fulk. A structure in which restrictions and parameters become clear, choices controllable, avoidable, replaceable, inescapable. In a word, parameters. For incontrovertible evidence as to the purely structural and therefore cognitive basis of these objects, look no further than the fact that we don't only use it to express how, say, an electric grid can be extended from point A to point B, but to articulate any such process involving linking two points through the same mechanism. It's really a cognitive structure that we specifically apply to scenarios of this sort. Think of how many other such cognitive structures we unknowingly extemporize to treat cases of one form or another. Your newfound awareness of the purely cognitive, although object-dependent, value of Fulk, despite seeming as no more than an awareness, allows you to employ it, to use it, to know it as a framework that you can readily interpolate into any problem you come upon. Meaning, given a different problem, say understanding the consequences of introducing a species or an element into a new environment, we can interpolate Fulk as a structure into the scheme, directing it at the new element, and through target case studies, observing how this new element behaves in different and diverse contexts, until a general enough conception is formed. a conspectus, as simple as that which describes the most fixed and invariant properties of an object, like how water is fluid, or how feline is a stealth-oriented predator, or that a predator is an organism that obtains nutrition by capturing and consuming another organism, or that organism is something that requires sustenance in the form of nutrients, and complex interlocking metabolic functions to grow and continue to exist, or that it's that whose continued existence comes in the form of complex metabolic systems that convert externally acquired food sources into time. When general propositions of this sort are conceived, one can say that we can predict how the aforementioned new element would behave and affect the environment into which it is to be introduced, and draw a broad spectrum of implications from this general definition. We've here employed Fulk as a cognitive tool to reduce an otherwise unpredictable and capricious object to a precise behavioral course whose every outline can be deduced from a simple datum, a phrase perhaps no more than a few words long.